Well, good morning. I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar today. Just a couple quick housekeeping items. Because of the number of people participating, we have everybody muted. It just helps to cut down on some of the background noise. So if you have a question as we go through this, if you just kind of put it in that question or chat box, dialog box, when we wrap up here in about 30 minutes or so, I'll go through those questions and try to answer any questions we have. I'll also provide my contact information, so if you want to give me a call or send me an email, again, can answer any questions that you might have. So we'll go ahead and get started. I know everybody's busy. I just wanted to mention we have other webinars that are coming up. We actually I'm also co-founder of a company called eReferenceCheck, which is a totally automated reference checking platform. So it removes all the time, labor, and cost of picking up a telephone and calling references. And we got a webinar coming up in early January, and you can always go on our website at safehiringsolutions.com. There's an upcoming webinars logo over on the right-hand column. Click on that, and you can register for any webinars that we have coming up. They're always free, but this is probably one of the more cutting-edge technologies, really reducing not only the time and labor of collecting reference information, which is really critical for volunteer organizations, but it also is returning a lot more information, and so just a quick note on that. A little bit on my background, founder and CEO of Safe Hiring Solutions, also the co-founder of eReferenceCheck. I grew up here in Indiana, graduated from Wabash College, and thought I was going to law school. Ended up becoming a violent crime detective with the city of Nashville, Tennessee. And so I spent about 7 years with the city of Nashville and helped start some violence prevention programs that dealt with child abuse and family violence. And so I left there in 1997 and started a business, consulting business, and did a lot of work with Department of Justice, Defense, Homeland Security, and traveled all over the United States and Europe working with communities to end violence against women and children. And that's kind of out of that company is where Safe Hiring Solutions was kind of birthed. We had a lot of public schools here in Indiana that were needing help on a pre-hire, needing help screening volunteers. And so back in around 2004, I ended up launching Safe Hiring Solutions, and it was primarily launched to help, public schools here in Indiana. We have since grown to about 2,800 clients. We have clients, I believe, in every state now. We work with a lot of volunteer organizations, some very large ones like Kiwanis International, and then we work with, Big Brothers Big Sisters, Boys and Girls Clubs. We work with, probably, 1,400 ministries across the United States. So, our real kind of niche in background screening is working with volunteer organizations or organizations that work with children. And so, much of what I'm going to talk about here in a minute just kind of will illustrate, some of the alarming things within the screening industry and how they approach background screening for volunteer organizations. Truthfully, there are absolutely no standards for what is considered a volunteer background check. I mean, you can Google that, and many of you may have Googled that already, and you've probably seen a million different things. And unfortunately, the industry that we are a part of has really been, I would say, at a minimum, it's immoral, but I mean, I think it really brushes close to being negligent in the way that they have promoted some of these cheap database type products and make it sound like that you as a volunteer or a non-for-profit can do comprehensive background screening for $6, $7, $8, $9, or $10 on these instant database products, and it's simply not true. So as a whole, the background screening industry has historically delivered a very, low quality product. It's kind of built itself on speed and low price instead of building itself on quality. And what we found is you can have quality, speed, and low price. All three can work together. So it's highly unregulated, and what that means is if you're an employer, so if you're hiring an employee, there are some rules that apply. You got the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act, which we'll talk about very briefly in a little bit. And so, federal law basically says you have to do a few things if you're going to hire an employee. You have to give them a disclosure statement, basically telling them what you're going to do. You have to receive, an authorization, either written or electronic. And then how you handle any adverse information then is also spelled out in federal law. So an employment candidate, and you get a background screening report that shows some adverse information that would cause you to rescind your offer, you have to follow a couple steps within the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. But if it's a volunteer and you're screening volunteers, there is really nothing. There's no requirements under the FCRA because it doesn't apply. And so most volunteer organizations and most advice is as long as you receive an authorization to do it, you can do about anything you want. It doesn't mean that you couldn't have some negligence, but there's no stipulation that says you have to meet this kind of threshold or this level of screening. So that is why the background screening industry has really populated these very cheap, low quality, instant type searches, because it really feeds the market. Because how would you, as an administrator, with a volunteer organization, have the time to go out and spend weeks or months researching all the nuances in criminal record keeping and background screening and best practices? I mean, it just simply can't be done. When somebody tells you they can do a national background check for $7, $8, or $9, you take that at face value, and it works pretty well, or it appears to work pretty well, until all of a sudden you have a volunteer that self-discloses something, you run a background check, and it comes back clear. How could that be? Some of the other crazy nuances within the screening industry is they do this limited reporting to 7 years. We've got a large volunteer organization in Indianapolis that just moved over to us about 8 or 9 months ago, and they actually ran our searches side by side with their current vendor. And the first, I believe it was 7 or 8 searches that they ran, 4 or 5 of those we found felony records, and their current vendor returned no records on any of them. And so they asked us, how could that be? And so as I audited the reports, what I found was, I said, right here on the first page, your current vendor has already disclaimed that they're going to search back 7 years from the date you enter this into their system. And most of these felony records that we found actually were beyond 7 years. It might have been 8, 9, or 10 years. So I said they've already disclaimed that they're not even looking back that far. So you've really got to look at what is the background screening firm providing. How far back are they going? My background in violent crimes and working with school districts and volunteer organizations, it's readily apparent to me that those folks that want to harm children always seek positions where they have access to children. So any organization that's serving children, you need to understand that you're already in a position where people who want to harm those children are trying to get in the door. And so these really low quality or limited scope searches really, put your organization at a disadvantage of trying to keep these people out. How do they handle alias names? These same reports, what we found was they were searching only the name that was entered into the system. So even though a candidate might have had a former married name or a maiden name, or we've seen men who have changed their name and had criminal records under a prior name, even though that information exists, unless you were requiring that they search that information, they weren't searching it. And oftentimes the standard is if you've got a candidate that's got current name, former married name, and say a maiden name, so they actually have been known by 3 names in the last 10 years, most screening firms are going to charge you as if those are 3 different searches, and we don't do that. We charge one fee, and we include that information. So those are just some of, kind of the nuances when we talk about how background screening can really get you in trouble. It's not that many companies or organizations are not doing background screening these days. Most organizations, I read something recently, it's upwards of around almost 80% of organizations are doing background checks. That's up from about 50% 6 or 7 years ago. So it's not that companies aren't doing background checks. The problem is these days they're doing very low quality background checks that are really not mitigating a lot of risk for them. There is this kind of belief within this, the volunteer world that, something is better than nothing. And I've heard a few attorneys kind of articulate this. And I think you could argue, well, obviously something is better than nothing, but not really when it comes to background screening, because, if you're running these cheap national database type searches and you're instantly getting, clears that are coming back, it provides a false sense of security. Because as most of you are, here in Indiana, Indiana is one state like many others. The only data they send into these so-called national databases is if you are convicted of a crime that would send you to prison, or if you're required to register as a sex offender. Well, that leaves the door open for the multitude of people convicted of crimes in Indiana do not fit into either one of those categories. So you can have serious felony convictions in Indiana, and you're not going to show up in these databases. You could be a school teacher in the eastern part of Indiana who was convicted recently of having sexual relations with a student, but she was not required to register as a sex offender, and she was not required to serve any prison time, so she's going to come back clear in those database search. Or a youth pastor just north of Indianapolis about 5 years ago that again was convicted of having sexual relations with a 16-year-old girl in his youth group. He was able to avoid prison with a plea bargain, and part of the plea bargain was that he did not have to register as a sex offender, so he doesn't show up in that national database search. You had a court case out of Elkhart, or in the Elkhart area, where a sex offender actually successfully sued to remove himself from the registry. And his basis for the lawsuit was he had pled guilty to a sex-related crime a month prior to the Indiana Sex Offender Registry being adopted. So he said, when I was found guilty or pled guilty, the Sex Offender Registry didn't exist, so I should not be required to register, and the courts actually agreed with him. So you got large pools of sex offenders that have even been convicted and are on the registry that are not going to show, or that are not on the registry because their crimes predated the registry's development. So the limited background checks, they expose, children or members of your organization to harm, unnecessary risk of harm or theft, and liability, a risk of liability for the lack of due diligence, which we'll look at in just a little bit. So the bottom line is there's no such thing as a $10 national background check. Simply can't be done. There's no such thing as an instant background check. If any of your background screening process is instant, it is not complete. Can't be. Even the FBI database is terribly incomplete. Washington Post actually published a study back in July looking at the FBI or NCIC database, and what they found was it was terribly erroneous. It was not created as an employment or volunteer screening tool. It was created as a law enforcement tool, and that they estimated some 600,000 errors in background checks annually within that system. So there is no way to do background screening instantly or for $10 or less. It just can't be done. But but you still see a lot of proliferation in the marketing of these because, again, there's no standard of care within the background screening industry. Cheap instant background checks. And what I'm seeing in the industry is a really slick kind of marketing tool where, they'll say, we will verify all records with the court. So basically you're getting this county search if something shows up in the instant database search. Well, the problem is there's no real data in these databases. They're incomplete. So the chances of actually finding a record in these databases is so low that the screening firms have basically said, we'll verify any hits that we find. Well, it sounds good and it sounds like you're getting a county search, but you're not. You're only getting a county search to supplement the database search once there's something that shows up, and the problem is the lack of data within the database to begin with. So we'll look at a best practice here in a minute. Here's just a few case studies I put together just to show you or illustrate, some of the problems with these databases. In this particular case study, these are ones that were clear in the national database, didn't show in the national sex offender, but they had records. I mentioned this first one just a minute ago. This is the Bible college student, the youth pastor north of Indianapolis. 3 counts, sexual misconduct with a minor, not going to show in the cheap search. Another case study, employment applicant had the following charges pending in court: rape and criminal deviant conduct. Well, the key word here is pending, and so this information had not made it into a database, even if the state where it happened actually does submit this data. Because it's pending and hasn't been adjudicated, it didn't show up in the national criminal database. It showed up in the county level search when we walked into the courts. This candidate had the following convictions: rape, child molesting, criminal confinement, DUI, and battery, and it didn't show in the national database search. The crimes actually were, I believe, about 18 years ago, and so in that particular jurisdiction, that information was not being submitted, that older data was not being submitted to a database provider. So without the county level search, this person walks in, it could be a volunteer. This one, they had aggravated armed robbery and a felony robbery, and again, didn't show up in the National Criminal Database search, but was found by doing that supplemental county criminal search. So again, no database is complete. Most databases are arrest-based, which really we're going to look at kind of 4 hot-button issues here in just a second. But one of the real hot-button issues is looking at arrest data versus conviction data. And so, you need to understand what that final outcome is, and especially in states where they limit the scope of what you can look at in terms of non-convictions. All hits should be verified with a court of record because records can be expunged. So here in Indiana, we just had an expungement law passed recently. And that expungement law basically says that if you've been convicted of a crime and it qualifies for expungement and you've had your record expunged, then it's as if it never happened. It can't be reported. It cannot be used against you. So it puts you at risk of liability if you use an expunged record against an individual. Well, what happens in a lot of these databases, like the limited criminal history or the national type databases, is that this information is not always updated or updated in a timely manner. So you may have seen something in the limited criminal history, you see something in national type database, and without verifying that with the court of record, you use that against a candidate, and that candidate's had their record expunged, then it could put you in a position where you could be liable for using that information. Records can be entered incorrectly. And then the FCRA, the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act, requires the use of up-to-date information. There's a lot of false positives with criminal databases. A lot of these states do not provide full identifiers or full dates of birth. They may provide partial dates of birth. Indiana is one of those states. They provide a partial date of birth. So you can imagine with candidates with a very common name like a John Smith, how many potential John Smiths exist in Indiana that have a criminal record. And even a criminal record with a month and year of birth match is not uncommon. So if you're using only a database, you may falsely, not allow somebody to volunteer or adversely impact a hiring decision when in fact it may or may not be that candidate. So, it's critical that, we're doing those county level searches to assure that that is the candidate that is applied to work or volunteer at your organization. And these are just a few examples of, using these databases, and it was not the candidate, and all three of these ended up in lawsuits, pretty significant amounts returned to the person who was falsely accused. And quite honestly, this Section 613 of the Fair Credit Reporting Act requires the use of most current information, and they would not consider a database as being current because the information is not updated regularly enough. So the proper use of a criminal database is to be a supplement to a screening program. And, some of our history here in Indiana, why the, public schools in Indiana were, begging for help, 10 years ago, is because all of them were using the limited criminal history. And the limited criminal history is, there's a couple problems. I know Indianapolis Public Schools back in 2004 hired 2 sex offenders who came back clear in the limited criminal history. The data just didn't exist because at that time Marion County was not sending their criminal records to the state, nor was Allen or Vanderburgh or a lot of other counties. And so as they went around and talked to the clerks in those counties, they didn't recognize that they were required to send that information to the state. The information is not updated regularly. The limited criminal history here in Indiana only contains Class A misdemeanors and above. So you could be convicted of domestic battery, and if it is reduced beyond a Class A misdemeanor, it's not going to be in the database. It's convictions only. So that is why in 2008 the state actually removed the limited criminal history as an option for schools and now require an expanded criminal history check. And this is kind of what best practices in background screening should look like. It should at minimum contain a social security number verification. I mean, that verifies identity, gives us any names associated with the candidate, correct spelling of names, address history, so we're making the right supplemental county criminal search recommendations, national criminal database search, national sex offender, and then the county criminal search. And then there are additional solutions. If you've got a volunteer employee that's going to drive, we can access all 50, Bureau of Motor Vehicle or Department of Motor Vehicles across the United States to, run driver's license reports. Federal criminal search are becoming much more popular because we're seeing more and more crimes being pushed into the federal courts. Like here in Indiana, it's like every state, 93–94% of crimes are crimes against the state. Somebody commits a crime of murder or DUI, that's a crime against the state, and whatever county it happens in, that's where the record's going to be. Well, the federal courts are, like here in Indiana, you've got a northern district and a southern district, and they hear crimes where it is a crime against the federal government or the U.S. government. And in the past, those have been crimes like FBI would investigate, white-collar type crimes. But with the proliferation of the Internet, we're seeing a lot more crimes ending up in the federal courts. It could be child solicitation online because your predator could be sitting in Bangkok or, Spokane, Washington, and he's soliciting a child here in Indiana, so it crosses those state lines. And so we've integrated with all the federal courts, so it's a relatively inexpensive search to add to your package, but it's becoming one that's really critical because of the nature of some of the crimes that are now being tried in the federal courts. Employment verifications, I mentioned e-reference check. we know that in the United States that less than 20% of the sex offenders in the United States have a criminal record. So 80% of sex offenders in the U.S. are undetected, meaning they don't have a criminal record. So if we rely on a criminal record alone, we're not going to be able to expose them. We're not going to keep them out of our organization. But by the use of e-reference check, and there's some tools within e-reference check, like a reference can also forward this reference check via email to somebody else they think we need to talk to. And so we've built some tools into it that might expose some things on a person who's one of those 80% that have had issues of boundary issues with children, hasn't risen to the point where they've been arrested or convicted, but somebody might disclose that because the e-reference check is anonymous. So it's all the information is aggregated by relationship with that candidate. So it doesn't say Mike McCarty said this about you. It basically says, you know, if I had 2 or 3 references that responded, these are the way they answered it. So it doesn't parse that information out. So it gives a bit of anonymity so that they can be honest and self-disclosing. I mentioned a little bit about due diligence. There's negligent hiring doctrine. Basically, if an employer hires someone they either knew or should have known was dangerous or unfit, and that it was foreseeable that somebody could be harmed, you could be sued for negligent hiring. Well, you're not going to hire somebody if you know that they are unfit, but it's the should have known that gets most organizations. And should have known is, wow, if we'd done a background check, it would have revealed this, we wouldn't have hired them, thus this person wouldn't have been harmed. And then you got negligent retention. And basically negligent retention is saying it's not only that you do background screening on employees or volunteers as you bring them into the organization, but you really need to be monitoring, you know, employees and volunteers through the whole course of their relationship with your organization. So background screening should not be a one and done deal. You know, most organizations are looking at, you know, maybe every 2 years to 5 years, just depending on the organization. But the idea is it needs to be an ongoing process. Things can change over the course of several years. And the interesting thing, and the reason I mentioned negligent hiring, though you do have employees, it also does apply to volunteers. And so here's a case right out of central Indiana several years ago, where the Southport Little League was successfully sued. They weren't doing any background checks. Coach was convicted sex offender, molested 2 kids in an outbuilding, and the volunteer organization, or Southport Little League, was found liable under negligent hiring doctrine. Even though this was a full-fledged volunteer and was not and did not create any kind of employment relationship, the Little League was still found negligent under this negligent hiring doctrine. They should have known. Had they been doing background checks, they would not have allowed this person to coach. Thus, these children would not have been harmed. So you can see that years ago we started to see this concept of negligent hiring being applied to volunteers. As we kind of wrap up here over the next couple minutes, I just want to kind of mention 4 really kind of hot button issues around the U.S. I mention these because some of them apply primarily just to employment, but you have employees, and as you hire, these things could impact what you're doing in the future. Ban the Box is a big one. This one is really snowballing across the country, and what it does is it removes questions on an application concerning criminal history. So where Ban the Box has been passed, it says you can no longer, as an employer, ask about criminal history on an application. And in places it could apply to volunteers as well. And it started out as kind of localized movements, but we're seeing now that state legislatures are actually looking at passing this statewide. And I think Minnesota just recently did that. You may have noticed that Target, who is headquartered out of Minnesota, changed their policy, and they're actually removing, that question on the application nationwide, even though it wouldn't apply to them, in Indiana at this point. But here in Indiana, this has been brought up in Marion County, and there's been ongoing discussion in Marion County for the last couple years on Ban the Box. The theory behind it is ex-offenders being disenfranchised, and so by not requiring them to disclose criminal history early in the process, they would have a better opportunity of articulating their criminal history during the interview stage. So it doesn't say you can't do a criminal background check, and it doesn't say you can't ask them about criminal history. It just says you have to postpone it to the interview stage. The problem with this is that A, removes a valuable tool for employers, because our employers, we coach them to run the criminal background check and compare the background check to your application. So there may be, and there are definitely instances we're made aware of, where an organization makes an adverse hiring decision, not because of the nature of the criminal record. It might be a public intox or something minor, but that they had been dishonest about it on the application. So for this information not to be on the application removes a valuable tool from your toolbox. And the other problem is really, how do you verify the authenticity of what that candidate tells you? So if the only disclosure of this happens at the interview stage, how do you know when that candidate gives you that additional information that it is accurate or inaccurate? There's no way to really verify that information. So I just want to make you aware that one, because it has crept up here in Indiana and very likely will kind of spread around the state, just like it has around the country. This one really deals with the EEOC passed their 2012-2016 strategic plan last spring, or a year ago this last spring. And basically what it says is, boil it down to this: you can't have zero tolerance policy, so you can't have a policy that says anybody that has a criminal record can't be hired. That you need to kind of use a three-pronged approach to look at what is the nature of the crime, how long ago did it happen, and how does that criminal record impact the position they're seeking. And we went through this with a school district here recently where it was a DUI from 20 years ago. He was applying as a custodian, and at first they were going to disqualify him, and I kind of coached them and said, look, DUI 20 years ago. He's got no criminal record for the past 20 years. This looks like a perfect candidate. Somebody that's done something 20 years ago. They learned from it. They've never done it since. They're not driving a school bus. It's a non-driving position. The perfect candidate. So it filters it through that kind of three-pronged approach. And the other thing that EEOC is recommending is that you give employment candidates an opportunity to explain any adverse information. So give them a platform to be able to explain anything in their report. We've talked a little bit about the Fair Credit Reporting Act. It does apply to you if you're using an outside screening firm for employment purposes. I mentioned that you're required to do the disclosure statement and authorization. And then if you take adverse action, it's actually a two-step process. You can't just simply tell somebody you're not going to be hired because of your criminal record. You have to issue a pre-adverse action letter, copy of the report, and give them a summary of their rights. They have a right to review anything that could be used against them. And then you send an adverse action letter, and those are usually separated by about 5 business days. And then the last one is social media checks. This tends to be an area where some of you may have already dipped your toe into this. You're Googling, you're looking around a little bit on the internet, but it's a really kind of wide open and a bit dangerous place to be right now. And we actually have seen a bill in Congress that would kind of remove this ability of doing these social media checks. And things to be careful of, because there can be legal implications, is discrimination. If you're looking at a blog, you're looking at a Facebook page, you might be seeing protected information, especially on the employment side, like marital status, age, race, etc. And yes, the courts have even ruled that the internet has a reasonable expectation of privacy, since a lot of these sites like Facebook might require friending so that you can't just access these sites without being a friend of this person. And then authenticity becomes the other issue. How do you know it's your candidate, with common names? So you're reading a blog post. How do you know that it was actually your candidate that posted that? How do we know somebody didn't do that to spite them? How do we know it's not a different John Smith? So there's a lot of issues to kind of really think about before you kind of dip your toe into the social media background checks arena. Verifying the information, your candidate, how you know that your candidate is not operating online under an assumed identity. So even your candidates, if they're sophisticated, they're probably not operating under their email address or name online if they're doing things they shouldn't be doing. So those are kind of the four really hot button issues these days in background screening. So I know we covered a ton of information. I've recorded this. I'll also make the PowerPoint slides available over the next couple days online. But I'm going to pause here a second, open up the chat box, and see if we have any questions. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. Either I answer them very well or I put everybody to sleep. So here's my contact information, phone number, email, our website. Again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to call or shoot me an email. Be happy to answer any questions you might have. Appreciate you guys taking a little time out of your day to listen in, and we hope you have a great day. Thanks. Bye.